The Prime Minister is self-isolating after coming into contact with a Conservative MP who has COVID. Lee Anderson had a half-hour meeting with Boris Johnson and later tested positive. The Prime Minister says he has no symptoms and will continue working from home. It comes after a dramatic few days in Downing Street and at a tense time in the Brexit trade talks. Also tonight, scientists behind the first promising COVID vaccine say a hard winter lies ahead, but life should return to normal towards the end of next year. Barack Obama tells the BBC his successor, President Trump, is partly responsible for polarization in America today.
We are very divided right now, certainly more than we were when I first ran for office in 2007, and more divided than we were 4 years ago.
That's for all the kids out there who dream the impossible.
A seventh World Championship title, Lewis Hamilton is now the most successful Formula One driver ever.
I've kept a list of the insults against Des O'Connor.
A consummate entertainer for 6 decades, Des O'Connor has died at the age of 88. Good evening. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is self-isolating in Downing Street after being contacted by NHS Test and Trace and told that he'd come into contact with a positive COVID case. Last week, he spent more than half an hour in a meeting with the Conservative MP Lee Anderson, who later tested positive for the virus. In the last hour, Mr Johnson has said he has no symptoms but is following the rules and will be leading the government's pandemic response from home. Here's our political correspondent, Nick Eardley.
This is Boris Johnson on Thursday with the Conservative MP Lee Anderson. They were part of a small group who held talks in Downing Street for just over half an hour. Since then, Mr Anderson has tested positive for coronavirus, and earlier today, the Prime Minister was told to self-isolate by NHS Test and Trace. The Prime Minister wrote to Tory MPs tonight. The good news is that NHS Test and Trace continues to improve. The bad news is that I've been pinged. It doesn't matter that we were all following the guidance and socially distancing. It doesn't matter that I feel fine, better than ever, or that my body is bursting with antibodies. The rules are the rules, and they are there to stop the spread of the disease. Mr Johnson will now work from here while he self-isolates. He plans to continue to communicate with the public, and his team are exploring ways he could take part in parliamentary proceedings remotely. But he won't be able to leave his flat in Downing Street for another 10 days. The Prime Minister has, of course, had the virus already.
Good afternoon.
This was back in April when he was released from intensive care. But a previous positive result isn't an exemption under the test and trace rules. I understand others who were at the meeting have been told to self-isolate too. Number 10 is said to be a COVID-secure workplace, but insiders say it's not possible to remove all risk. The timing is far from ideal for the Prime Minister, who was planning to be out and about this week, trying to move his government on after days of headlines about infighting in his team and some very public departures.
Nick Eardley, who's live in Downing Street now. Let's talk more about the impact of this, given the timing, Nick, just after all those changes in Downing Street.
Yeah, Michelle, what Number 10 have planned for the next week, they might not be calling a reset for the government, but it certainly sounds a lot like one. Before Boris Johnson was told to self-isolate, his diary was jam-packed. He had talks with the Chancellor penciled in to make some big spending decisions. He was due to hold talks with the scientists about how to lift lockdown in England on the 2nd of December. He was due to make big decisions about Brexit, and he was also supposed to meet many Tory MPs who've been frustrated at how Number 10 has been working and are hoping that things might now change. Got to say, Boris Johnson is striking a defiant tone in messages to Tory MPs, telling them tonight that self-isolation, won't change any of those plans, and that he's more confident than ever that lockdown in England will be lifted in a few weeks' time. But at a time when the Prime Minister wanted to be out and about on the front foot, the timing is far from ideal.
Nick Eardley in Downing Street, thank you. Well, one of the scientists behind the first COVID vaccine to emerge successfully from early clinical trials says that it won't start to make a significant difference until next summer. Professor Ugur Sahin, whose company BioNTech developed the vaccine with the pharmaceutical giant Pfizer, told the BBC Today this would be a hard winter, but normal life should be resuming this time next year. He also believes the vaccine will reduce the spread of infection as well as disease. Our health correspondent Sophie Hutchinson reports.
Tiny vials of the new BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, which hold the world's hope for an end to the pandemic. But today, one of its creators from the husband and wife team warned there were still many months to get through.
This winter will be hard. So we will not have a big impact on the infection numbers with our vaccine in this winter. The bigger impact will happen until summer. The summer will help us anyway, because the infection rate will go down in summer. And what is absolutely essential is that we get a high vaccination rate before autumn, winter next year.
There are still many unknowns about this new vaccine. How long does immunity from it last? Well, its creators say you might need a jab every year, every 2 years, or every 5 years. It's just too early to tell. And how effective is it in older people? Well, up to 40% of those who took part in this trial that's been deemed so successful were older people, and we should get more data on them in the next few weeks. And will it stop transmission from one person to another? Well, its creators again say that it seems to have been so successful at reducing illness in people that they are very hopeful that it could have a big impact on transmission too.
I'm very confident that transmission between people will be reduced by such a highly effective vaccine. Maybe not 90%, but maybe 50%. But we should not forget that even that could result in a dramatic reduction of the pandemic spread.
But we won't know for sure until we see the data in a few months. Others have sounded a note of caution about the possibility the virus could mutate, and that any successful vaccine needs to be able to adapt at speed.
We mustn't take our eye off the ball. The virus is an RNA virus and is highly likely to change, and we need to keep a watchful eye out for that and be able to respond if necessary.
But there is genuine excitement about the vaccine, which will be given to those who live and work in care homes as a priority. 10 million doses should be here by the end of the year. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News.
Well, let's take a look at the latest figures released on coronavirus. Another 24,962 new infections were recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means an average of 25,329 new cases per day in the last week. There were an average of 1,656 hospital admissions per day in the week to last Wednesday. Another 168 deaths were reported today. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It means an average of 413 deaths per day in the last week. The total number of UK deaths is now 51,934. The former US President Barack Obama has told the BBC that America is more divided today than it was when he was elected 12 years ago. He said his successor, Donald Trump, was partly responsible because he had actively fanned division for political purposes. Our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, reports.
So help me God. Congratulations, Mr. President.
The election of America's first black president was seen by many as a watershed moment, a step towards ending historic divisions that had scarred the United States. But Barack Obama now believes those divides are deepening. Divisions not just of race, but also inequality.
We are very divided right now. Certainly more than we were when I first ran for office in 2007, and more divided than we were 4 years ago when Donald Trump first won the presidency. Some of that is attributable to our current president, who actively fanned division because he felt it was good for his politics. But it preceded him, and it will outlast him.
In part, he says, That's because some Americans feel they've lost their grip on the ladder of economic advancement and can be persuaded it's someone else's fault. Resentments fanned, he says, by conspiracy-fueled social media.
Crazy conspiracy theories and what some have called truth decay, right, where facts don't matter, that has contributed enormously to these divisions.
And oh yes, he believes the current president has played his part.
What's been interesting, obviously, and sad during this election is that that kind of lack of fidelity to the truth has consequences when it's being promoted by the most powerful elected official in the country.
Fixing that truth decay, he suggests, will take time and, potentially, better regulation of the internet and the media.
I think at some point it's going to require a combination of regulation and standards within industries to get us back to the point where we at least recognize a common set of facts before we start arguing about what we should do about those facts.
Talk about our bromance.
As a new president prepares for his first term, his predecessor is mulling the legacy he left his country. Mr. Obama says the US was better off after his 8 years in office, but he accepts deep fault lines in American culture remain. James Landale, BBC News.
And you can see the full interview in a special programme, Barack Obama Talks to David Olusoga, this Wednesday on BBC One at 7:30. The Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall have become the first members of the royal family to attend Germany's annual remembrance of victims of war and dictatorship. And in a speech at the German Parliament, the Prince said the bonds between the UK and Germany would endure after Brexit. Our correspondent Damien McGuinness reports from Berlin.
A day of remembering the victims of war, but also a reminder of the miracle of reconciliation between two countries who were once enemies. This is the first time that a member of the royal family has come for this commemoration.
The meaning of this National Day of Mourning has evolved over the years. For the Nazis, it was about glorifying war, but for modern Germany, it's about pursuing peace and remembering all victims of oppression, a message echoed by the wreath of poppies laid here by Prince Charles.
Today's visit comes at a crucial time for the UK's relationship with its near neighbours. In a speech in the German Parliament building, at times speaking in German, Prince Charles said that although the UK has chosen a future outside the European Union, Britain and Germany will remain close.
Wir werden immer Freunde, Partner und Verbündete sein.
We will always be friends, partners and allies, he said, and called on the two countries to reaffirm their bond for the years ahead. The Parliament building was damaged by the Allies in the Second World War, but it was later redesigned by a British architect, a fitting place to talk about how war can be replaced by friendship. Damien McGuinness, BBC News, Berlin.
Tributes have been paid to one of Britain's best-known entertainers, Des O'Connor, who's died at the age of 88. The comedian, singer and television star had a career spanning 6 decades, from The Morecambe and Wise Show to Countdown and more. Today he was remembered as a consummate professional and one of the old school. Our arts correspondent David Silito looks back at his life.
I've kept a list of the insults against Des O'Connor.
Des O'Connor was in the 70s famous, a star, and on Morecambe and Wise the butt of hundreds of gags. But the singer and comedian took it all with good grace.
Number one, Eric, I've just heard some good news. Ernie, what good news? Eric, Des O'Connor's got a sore throat.
Nothing seemed to dent that clean-cut, deep-tanned optimism.
Number two, Ernie, Des O'Connor is a self-made man. Eric, I think it's very nice of him to take the blame.
Be sure it's true when you say, I love you, love you, love you.
He recorded more than 30 albums in a career that took him from Butlins to Las Vegas to Countdown.
He was the ultimate professional, and that's why he worked from his time as a redcoat back in the 1950s until a year or two ago. In his mid-80s, he was still touring with his one-man show and with a two-man show with Jimmy Tarbuck. Aged 85, he was still out there singing, dancing, telling jokes.
Loneliness, alone you'll always find me.
The son of a dustman from London's East End, he made more than 1,000 appearances at the Palladium, and on television he could look back on more than 40 years of chat shows. But the success always came with a touch of self-deprecation.
A little old lady came up to me one day at the stage door. She said, "Mr. O'Connor, I have enjoyed your show." She said, "Here's £5. Could you send me your new LP?" So I said, "Well, you can get it for £3 in the shop, but you don't have to give me £5." She said, "Well, no, because the last time I went into the shop and asked for a Des O'Connor LP, the guy said, 'You're kidding.'"
As the decades rolled by, he remained an almost ageless fixture in the schedules. He was never really fashionable, and so never fell out of fashion.
Am I or am I not?
It was a career of 60 years of professional, unflappable, good-natured charm.
You have my word. Well, that's good enough for me.
And when the joke was on him, he was always the first to laugh.
Des O'Connor, who's died aged 88. Time now for the sport. Let's join Ollie Foster at the BBC Sports Centre. Hello, Ollie.
Thank you, Michelle. Lewis Hamilton says that clinching a 7th World Championship is the pinnacle of his life so far. He won the Turkish Grand Prix in treacherous conditions to equal Michael Schumacher's record of Formula One titles. Here's our sports correspondent, Joe Wilson.
It's lights out and away we go. When the circuit just slips, when the tyres won't grip, well, that's when champions win. In Turkey, driving was like dancing on ice. Spin out! Valtteri Bottas, theoretically the title rival, spun so often he finished a lap behind Lewis Hamilton. And Max Verstappen? Exactly. Hamilton, through it all, was serene. Having started 6th, like this, he took the lead. This victory was its own triumph. Lewis Hamilton wins the Turkish Grand Prix!
Thank you so much, everyone, for your support.
He's won more races than anyone. He's now a 7-time world champion, same as Michael Schumacher, the most titles ever.
We dreamed of this as when we were young, and when I was young, when we were watching the Grand Prix, and this is way, way beyond our dreams. And I think it's so important for kids out there to hopefully see this and know that don't listen to anybody that tells you you can't achieve something. Dream the impossible.
And so to Lewis, just turned 17. Lewis Piaget, karting before lockdown in Kent, aiming for Formula One, in a sport still dominated by white competitors, by the wealthy. This Lewis has Hamilton inspiration.
Seeing him at the highest level, doing what he does best, it really gives me the push to carry on, because seeing that he's made it to the top, it just shows me that I can do the same thing. He's been the start to the change in the diversity we see in F1.
Lewis Piaget is still making his journey, and it's a tough one, but he has a Lewis to follow, the man who is statistically simply the best in history. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
Dustin Johnson is the new Masters champion. The American dominated the final round at Augusta, winning by 5 strokes to claim his 2nd major title. The world number 1 also set the record for the lowest total score at the Masters, 20 under par, to claim the green jacket from Tiger Woods. Rory McIlroy was tied for 5th, 9 shots behind.
Congratulations, Dustin.
Ray Clements has died at the age of 72. He was an ever-present in the great Liverpool team of the 1970s, and he won 61 England caps. He'd been living with advanced prostate cancer. Andy Swiss reports.
When it came to the art of goalkeeping, few could beat Ray Clements.
That was a supreme save by Clements.
In Liverpool's all-conquering team of the 1970s, Clements was the cornerstone. His courage and composure key to their success. It brought him 5 league titles, 3 European Cups and legendary status. Even after he moved to Tottenham in 1981, the Liverpool fans welcomed him back like a hero.
And a fantastic reception from the Kop.
He won the FA Cup with Spurs, as well as 61 caps with England. Only the presence of Peter Shilton prevented him winning more. He later joined England's coaching staff, and across football, there were few more popular figures.
He always had time for people. We all, as keepers, have massive highs and desperate lows. And throughout all of that, whether it be a high or a low, you always got the same Ray Clemence smile.
Goalkeeper Ray Clemence.
But for all his warmth and wisdom, it's for moments like this that Ray Clemence will be best remembered.
Oh, what a save!
One of England's goalkeeping greats.
Ray Clemence, who's died at the age of 72. Well, England's players paid tribute to Clemence in the Nations League this evening. They lost 2-0 to Belgium. There was a good win for Wales, defeat for Northern Ireland. Sports Scene follows the news for viewers in Scotland. If you were trying to avoid the Scots result, well, their match is also coming up in Natalie Perk's report.
Wearing black armbands in honour of Ray Clemence, England travelled to Belgium knowing only a win would do. But the world's #1 side hadn't lost at home for 4 years, and they were off to a flyer, Romelu Lukaku finding Yuri Tielemans in space. A dubious free kick was handed to Belgium, and Dries Mertens gave Jordan Pickford no chance. England were the better side in the second half, but ultimately had nothing to show for it. Their hopes of qualifying for the Nations League finals are over. Scotland fans are no doubt still celebrating after winning their Euros playoff final last week. But in Slovakia, Steve Clarke's side had lost their fizz somewhat. The only goal of the match came courtesy of Jan Grey Goose to end Scotland's 9-match unbeaten streak. Northern Ireland suffered the agony of playoff final loss last week, and in Austria their losing streak continued. They'd taken the lead late in the second half, but Austria came back to win 2-1. Meanwhile, in Cardiff, Wales chalked up their 7th successive clean sheet in a competitive match as they beat Republic of Ireland 1-0. A change of shape in the second half brought immediate results, with David Brooks' head of the difference to leave Wales at the top of their group with 1 match still to go. Natalie Perks, BBC News.
Well, of course, you can find all the reaction to those matches on the BBC Sport website. Michelle.
Ollie, thank you very much. And that's it from us now on BBC One. Time for the news wherever you are. Good night.